reflecting back on it as a writer does. The next passage, I'm just going to warn you, there's some gore at the end of this passage. It's not pleasant to listen to. It's the only gore you're going to encounter in the reading, but I do want you to know about it. A deer is going to die in an unpleasant way. But I'm reading it because it was a pivotal experience for me as I thought about violence. I was living on a military base at the time. My family moved from Tennessee to Ohio. My father worked for Firestone. He was a tire builder. And then he worked loading bombs in a munitions factory in Mississippi for Firestone. And then they moved to Ohio to do the same thing in Ohio, to work in a bomb factory. And we actually lived inside the military base where the bomb factory was. And inside that base, there were hundreds upon hundreds of deer. And so the only way they could control the deer population was to sell a number of deer tags each year to hunters who would come in and kill deer. And it really was like shooting ducks in a galley. Because there were fences all around, the deer couldn't escape, basically. And there were hundreds upon hundreds of them. And one of the groups that came each year to hunt, actually not to hunt, to kill deer, were high military officials from the Pentagon who came to this place in Ohio, got their deer licenses, and local boys were hired to gather up a herd of deer and drive them past a blind where the generals were waiting with their guns. And when I turned 16, my dad finally gave me permission to be one of those boys. I wanted to be one for years. He set that up. He set up this quote-unquote hunt for the generals, and this is that experience. On that Saturday morning, I rode along with some 20 other boys to a parking lot encircled by munitions bunkers in a far corner of the arsenal. The army bus that carried us might have been the same khaki bus I had ridden back and forth to elementary school, only now, when I slouched in the seat, my legs reached all the way to the floor. I had known some of the other boys since first grade. Their faces had filled out, and a few of them had begun to show a hint of beard. We piled from the bus and stamped our boots while Dad, who had arrived here separately in an army jeep, instructed us in how to herd deer. He spoke well, as he always did, at ease, yet forceful, with a sense of authority that came from knowing the crowd and knowing his stuff. He was a charmer, as Mother often said. He could have coaxed a bear out of a den or a dollar bill out of a wallet with that voice of his, the way he had coaxed Mama into marrying him against her better judgment. So wear your hats, Dad concluded, holding up one of the bright orange stocking caps that a soldier was distributing to us, and chase those whitetails until you get to the lakes where the bus will pick you up. Whatever you do, don't go anywhere near the shooting. Without having paid any more attention to me than he would have to any other boy, Dad sped away in the jeep, off to join the generals in the blinds. Our orange-capped platoon fanned out with the wind at our backs and set off tramping past the munitions bunkers toward the meadow where Dad had told us deer would be munching hay. And sure enough, on reaching the meadow, we found maybe 15 deer quietly feeding. A couple of bucks with antlers as wide as bicycle handlebars looked up at our advancing line, sniffed nervously, and stamped their front hooves. When we kept on coming, they whirled about, and the whole bunch went bounding away. From the white flags of their tails, we could see they were heading downwind toward the lakes, as Dad had predicted they would. And so we pursued them for a mile or so, waving our arms, yelling, our boots crunching the brittle snow. The herd gradually increased as more and more deer were gathered up in the chase. By the time we came within sight of the first lake, perhaps as many as 50 deer wheeled and pranced before us, their eyes rolling, their breath coming in snorts. Following Dad's instructions, we formed a semicircle and funneled the herd onto a strip of land separating the last two lakes. And there we stopped, while the deer poured on in the only direction available, straight past the blinds where the generals waited. Within seconds we heard the crackle of shots, like the rattle of hail on a tin roof, then a tapering off into silence, and then a chorus of celebratory shouts. The generals had made their kills. But some of the generals, it turned out, had only wounded their deer, which ran away, leaving trails of blood across the snow. Dad had taught me on our hunts for rabbits and squirrels that if you merely wound an animal, you must track it down if you can and put it out of its misery. To let it slowly bleed to death is lazy and cruel. But the generals argued over who had muffed their shots, and none of them would go in pursuit. And so before our ragtag platoon could board the bus, Dad fetched me and a few other boys to help him track down the stragglers. If the deer we found had already died, he told us, we were to drag the carcasses back here to the killing ground. If we found a deer fallen but alive, we were to cut its throat. Dad loaned his knife to the one boy among us who hadn't carried one of his own. And we weren't to mess up the heads of any bucks, in case the generals wanted to mount the antler trophies. Through all these instructions, Dad said nothing that might get him fired if it found its way back to the generals, but I could sense the fury in his face and voice. Starting at the bloody, mired spot near the blind where men were gutting the downed deer, Dad set each of us boys to follow a separate crimson trail. My deer had left such a spoor of blood that I knew it couldn't have gone far. Entering the woods and weaving in and out among the trees, the hoof prints at first punched cleanly into the snow and spread far apart in the panic of flight, soon became messy, wobbling side to side as the deer had begun to stagger. I was so intent on studying the tracks that I came within a few yards of the deer before I saw it. And I saw it then only because I heard a low, keening sigh. It was a good-sized buck with a rack of 10 or 12 points sprawled on his side in the snow. He had been shot in the belly, and his entrails dangled out. Red foam bubbled from his mouth. As I approached, his legs were jerking in phantom flight, and his rib cage swelled and sank with each gasp of breath. Fighting down nausea, I knelt at his shoulder, tugged off my gloves, pulled out my knife, and drew the blade across his throat. On the first pass, I failed to cut through the dense pelt. The buck's head lifted, and his great, glassy eye stared at me, unblinking. I asked his forgiveness. Pressing harder, I drew the blade again, and this time blood gushed over my fist. With the last sigh, the head slumped, the black eyes glazed over. I stood up and leaned against a tree and heaved until my stomach was empty. I couldn't stand the thought of the entrails snagging on brush as I dragged the carcass back, so I slit the belly and tugged out the steaming guts into a pile on the snow. Crows and vultures and smaller scavengers would feast on it. I scoured the blade with a handful of snow, wiped it dry on my jeans, then slid the knife into its sheath. Not knowing how else to honor the deer, I smeared a hand across my forehead so I could wear his blood. Even though I had not shot this buck, I had chased him into the line of fire, and I had finished the killing. It was my first deer, and it would be my last. I'm certainly not against hunting. My dad was a hunter. I hunted as a boy. But that wasn't hunting. It was a kind of high-tech slaughter. And most modern warfare is actually high-tech slaughter. People killed from 5 miles in the air or 20 miles away with shells, or from bombs that have been planted under the dirt. There's very little killing in modern warfare where people are actually face-to-face with the person they're killing.